The blood on Margaret Harper's hands had long dried, but the memory of her husband's death remained as fresh as the Wyoming wind that now howled through the cracks of her weathered farmhouse. She stood at the window of her small homestead just outside Laramie, watching the sun rise over land that seemed determined to swallow her whole, just as it had swallowed Thomas 3 months prior, when his horse threw him into a ravine during what should have been a routine cattle drive. Margaret was 24 years old, and already the prairie had taken everything from her except this struggling patch of earth and the 2 horses that needed feeding. The animals were restless in their small stable, and she knew what they wanted, what they needed: oats and barley. The same things Thomas had always provided, the same things she now had to beg or barter for because the last harvest had been poor and her stores were nearly depleted. She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders, feeling the October chill of 1882 seep through the thin fabric. The neighbors had been kind at first, bringing casseroles and condolences, but their charity had limits. This was Wyoming territory, where survival trumped sympathy, and a woman alone was seen as either a burden or an opportunity for the wrong kind of attention. Margaret had rejected 3 marriage proposals in as many weeks, each from men who looked at her land with more interest than they looked at her face. She would rather starve than become a transaction, another piece of property changing hands like livestock at auction. The horses whinnied again, their hunger cutting through her thoughts. She had perhaps 2 more days of feed left, stretched thin and mixed with hay that was more dust than substance. After that, she would have to make a choice she did not want to face. The knock at her door came just as she was pulling on her work boots. Margaret froze, her heart hammering. Morning visitors were rare and rarely brought good news. Through the window, she could see a tall figure on her porch, hat in hand, not the posture of someone looking for trouble. She grabbed the rifle Thomas had taught her to shoot, holding it low but ready, and opened the door a crack. The man standing there was perhaps 27 or 28, with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of creek water after a storm. His sandy hair needed cutting, and his clothes marked him as someone who worked for a living, not one of the ranch owners who had been circling her property like vultures. "Madam," he said, his voice low and respectful, "I am Samuel Peterson. I work at the Henderson Ranch about 5 miles north. I heard in town you might be needing some help with feed for your animals." Margaret's grip on the rifle tightened. "Who told you that?" "Mrs. Chen at the general store. I was not eavesdropping, madam. She mentioned it when I was buying supplies. Said you had been in asking about credit for oats and barley." He shifted his weight, still making no move to come closer. "I've got some extra from my wages. Mr. Henderson pays us partly in goods. I have got more than I need for my own horse." "I cannot pay you," Margaret said flatly. Pride tasted like copper in her mouth, but honesty seemed safer than debt. "I was not asking for payment." Samuel Peterson put his hat back on, as if preparing to leave. "I lost my own mother when I was 16. She was alone after my father died, trying to keep our small farm in Missouri going. Nobody helped her. I watched her work herself into an early grave because she was too proud to ask and folks were too busy to notice." He met her eyes then, and she saw no pity there, only a kind of understanding that made her throat tight. "I cannot help her anymore. But maybe I can help someone else who is in a hard place." Margaret stood there, the morning sun climbing higher, warming nothing. Every instinct Thomas had cultivated in her during their 5 years of marriage screamed caution. Trust was a luxury in the Wyoming territory. People took advantage. People lied. People saw weakness and exploited it, but her horses needed to eat, just the feed, she said finally. "I will not be indebted beyond that." "Just the feed," Samuel agreed. "I have got 2 bags in my wagon, Where would you like them?" She directed him to the small stable, watching from the doorway as he hefted the heavy sacks with practiced ease. The horses perked up immediately at the sound and smell, their ears forward with interest. Samuel set the bags down carefully, then looked around the small structure with an assessing eye. "Your roof has got a weak spot there," he said, pointing to the corner where daylight showed through a gap in the boards. "Winter is coming on hard. That will not hold against heavy snow." "I know," Margaret said, hating how defensive she sounded. "I have not had time to fix it yet." Samuel nodded, asking no more questions. He showed her how much to feed the horses, measuring out portions that would stretch the supply while still keeping the animals healthy. His hands were careful with the oats and barley, and the horses responded to him with easy trust, the kind that came from someone who understood animals. "I will be going then," he said when the horses were happily eating. "I work early mornings at the Henderson Ranch, but I pass this way most days. If you need anything else, you can let me know." Margaret wanted to say no, to close this door before it opened any wider, but the words would not come. Instead, she nodded stiffly and watched him climb back into his wagon and drive away, the wheels crunching on the frost-hardened ground. She did not see him for 3 days. In that time, a storm rolled through that turned the world white and made her grateful for the oats and barley keeping her horses fed and calm. She spent the hours repairing what she could of the house, rationing her own food, and trying not to think about what would happen when the supplies ran out again. On the 4th morning, another knock came. This time, Margaret opened the door without the rifle. Samuel Peterson stood there again, this time with a toolbox in one hand and lumber balanced on his shoulder. "I brought materials for your stable roof," he said before she could speak. "I have got a few hours before I am needed back at the ranch. Thought I would fix that gap before the next storm." "Mr. Peterson, I already told you I cannot pay." "I know what you said, madam. I am not asking for payment. I am asking if I can fix your roof before your horses freeze." He said it simply, without judgment, and somehow that made it impossible to refuse. Margaret stepped aside and let him work. She told herself she would stay in the house, keep her distance, maintain the boundary between charity and obligation. But after an hour, curiosity and something else, something that felt dangerously like loneliness, drew her outside. Samuel was on the stable roof, working with efficient precision. He had stripped off his jacket despite the cold, and she could see the lean muscle of his shoulders moving beneath his shirt as he hammered boards into place. He worked quietly, no wasted motion, the mark of someone who had spent a lifetime doing physical labor. "You are good at this," Margaret said, feeling foolish as soon as the words left her mouth. Samuel glanced down, no mockery in his expression. "My father was a carpenter before he tried farming. He taught me young. It is one of the few things I remember clearly about him. The smell of sawdust and the sound of his hammer." "How old were you when he died?" 10. "Fever took him one winter. My mother tried to keep the farm going, but she did not know enough and nobody would teach a woman. By the time I was old enough to help properly, the bank had already started foreclosure proceedings." He drove another nail home with 3 solid strikes. "We lost everything when I was 16. She died that same winter. I think it was a broken heart more than anything else." Margaret understood that kind of death, the kind where the body gave up because the spirit had already gone. "I am sorry," she said. "It was a long time ago." Samuel moved to the next section of roof. "But it taught me that help matters. That sometimes the difference between surviving and going under is just one person giving a damn." The words hung in the cold air between them. Margaret found herself watching the way his hands moved, capable and sure, fixing something she could not fix alone. It had been so long since anyone had done anything for her without expecting something in return. "Why are you really helping me?" she asked. Samuel stopped hammering and looked down at her. "Because you need help. Because I can give it. Does it need to be more complicated than that?" "In my experience, yes." "Then maybe your experience has been with the wrong kind of people." He returned to his work, and Margaret stood there feeling something crack open inside her chest, something that had been frozen solid since Thomas died. When Samuel finished the roof, he climbed down and inspected his work from the ground, making sure everything was secure. The gap was gone, the stable was sound, and Margaret found herself struggling with words that had never come easily. "Thank you," she managed finally. "You are welcome." He gathered his tools, loading them back into his wagon. "I will bring more feed next week. The oats and barley should last until then if you measure it out like I showed you." "Mr. Peterson, Samuel," he said. "If I am going to be helping with your horses, you might as well call me Samuel." "Samuel," she corrected, the name feeling strange and familiar at once. "I do not want charity." "Then do not think of it as charity. Think of it as neighbors helping neighbors. That is how people survive out here, Mrs. Harper, by looking out for each other." After he left, Margaret went back into her house and sat by the stove, her hands wrapped around a cup of weak coffee. The stable roof was fixed. Her horses had food. And for the first time since Thomas died, she felt something other than the crushing weight of despair. She felt hope, and it terrified her. Samuel came back the following week with more oats and barley, just as he had promised. This time, Margaret had coffee ready, the real kind she had been saving, and she offered it to him when he finished feeding the horses. They sat on her porch in the weak November sunlight, drinking coffee and saying little. But the silence was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that came when two people had both known hard times and did not need to fill the air with meaningless words. "How long were you married?" Samuel asked eventually. 5 years. Thomas and I came out here from Ohio right after we wed. We thought we would build something together." Margaret stared into her coffee cup. "He was a good man. Not perfect, but good. He worked hard. He loved this land. Do you love it?" The question caught her off guard. Nobody had asked her that before. Everyone assumed she loved the homestead because Thomas had loved it, because she had stayed after his death. "I do not know," she admitted. "Sometimes I think I hate it. This place took him from me. But then I think about leaving and I cannot do it. It is all I have left of him, of us." Samuel nodded slowly. "My mother was the same way about our farm in Missouri. Even when it was killing her, she could not let it go. She felt like leaving would mean my father died for nothing." "And you think she was wrong?" "I think she was human. I think grief makes us hold onto things that hurt us because letting go feels like betrayal." He set his coffee cup down carefully on the porch railing. "But I also think the people we love would not want us to destroy ourselves trying to preserve their memory." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes and blinked them back furiously. "You do not understand. Thomas loved this place. He died trying to make it work." "And you are still alive," Samuel said quietly. "That has to count for something." The words settled over her like snow, cold and undeniable. She was still alive. Some days that felt more like a curse than a blessing, but Samuel was right. It had to count for something. "I should get back to work," Samuel said, standing and collecting his cup. "But I will be by again next week. Your horses will need more feed by then." "Samuel," Margaret said as he started toward his wagon, "why do you keep coming back, truly?" He turned to look at her, and in the afternoon light, his eyes seemed even more gray-green than before, the color of sagebrush after rain. "Because I see you trying," he said. "Because every morning you get up and take care of those horses even though everything else is falling apart. Because you have not given up, even though you have every reason to. That is worth something to me. That is worth helping. After he left, Margaret went to the stable and stood with her horses, running her hands over their warm flanks. They nickered softly, content now that they had proper food in their bellies. Samuel was right. She got up every morning and fed them. She hauled water and mucked stalls and kept going when everything in her wanted to stop. Maybe that was enough. Maybe just surviving, just continuing to breathe and move and care for these animals, was its own kind of victory. The weeks passed, and Samuel came every few days. Sometimes he brought feed. Sometimes he brought supplies to fix other small things around her property: a broken fence post, a loose board on the porch, a door that would not close properly. He never asked permission and never stayed longer than necessary, but his presence became something Margaret found herself anticipating. She started keeping better coffee on hand, started making extra biscuits in the morning so she would have something to offer him, started washing her face and braiding her hair instead of just pinning it back haphazardly. The other ranchers noticed. Margaret heard the whispers when she went into Laramie for supplies, saw the looks from the women who had been Thomas's friends. They thought she was moving on too quickly. They thought she was being improper, letting a single man help her without chaperone or propriety. Margaret discovered she did not care what they thought. December arrived with bitter cold and heavy snow. Margaret woke one morning to find her water pump frozen solid and her woodpile running dangerously low. She was trying to thaw the pump with heated stones when Samuel's wagon appeared through the snow like an apparition. He took one look at her situation and immediately set to work. By afternoon, he had the pump working again and had split enough wood to see her through the next few weeks. His hands were red and raw from the cold by the time he finished, and Margaret insisted he come inside to warm up. It was the first time Samuel had been inside her house. He stood awkwardly in the small main room, seeming too large for the space, too alive among the remnants of her life with Thomas. Margaret poured him coffee and added a splash of whiskey she kept for medicinal purposes, pressing the warm cup into his cold hands. "Sit down," she said. "You will catch your death standing there like a fence post." Samuel sat at her small table, the same table where she and Thomas had eaten 1,000 meals. If he felt the strangeness of it, he did not show it. "You cannot keep doing this alone," he said after a long silence. "Winter is only going to get harder. You need more than just someone dropping by every few days." "What are you suggesting?" Margaret's voice came out sharper than she intended. "That I sell this place, marry one of the men who keeps proposing so they can take over Thomas's land. I am suggesting you accept that you need help. Real help. Not just patched roofs and bags of grain, but someone here regularly, someone who can do the heavy work that is too much for one person alone. I cannot afford to hire help. You know that." Samuel wrapped both hands around his coffee cup, staring into the dark liquid. "I could work here in the mornings before I go to the Henderson ranch. Do the things that need doing, in exchange for meals and a place to sleep when the weather is too bad to make it back to the bunkhouse." Margaret stared at him. "People would talk. People are already talking." "It would ruin my reputation." "Your reputation will not keep you alive when you are trying to break ice on the water trough in a blizzard." Samuel looked up at her then, his expression serious. "I am not trying to take advantage, Mrs. Harper. I am trying to keep you from working yourself to death the way my mother did. If having me here feels wrong, I will leave and not come back. But I think you know you need help, and I think you know I am not going to hurt you." Margaret's hands shook as she lifted her own coffee cup. He was right. She knew he was right. But accepting his help meant acknowledging how much she had been struggling, how close she was to losing everything. "Just the mornings," she said finally. "You do the heavy work, I will provide meals, nothing more." Nothing more, Samuel agreed. He moved into the small tack room attached to the stable 2 days later, bringing a bedroll and his few possessions. Margaret helped him make the space habitable, hanging an old quilt over the window for insulation and providing extra blankets from her own linen closet. It was not much, but it was dry and out of the wind, and Samuel seemed grateful for it. The arrangement changed everything and nothing. Samuel was there every morning before dawn, taking care of the horses, chopping wood, hauling water, doing the 100 small tasks that kept the homestead functional. Margaret cooked breakfast and dinner, finding herself making larger portions, better food than she had bothered with when she was alone. They fell into a rhythm that felt both natural and terrifying. Samuel would work until mid-morning, then head to the Henderson Ranch for his paid work, returning in the evening to finish anything that needed doing. They would eat dinner together at her small table, talking quietly about the day, the weather, the horses. They did not talk about Thomas. They did not talk about what people in town were saying. They did not talk about the way Margaret had started to notice the line of Samuel's jaw, or the way he looked at her sometimes when he thought she was not paying attention. Christmas came and went, marked only by Margaret cooking a slightly larger meal and Samuel bringing her a small pine tree he had cut from the property line. They decorated it with strings of dried berries and small ornaments Margaret had brought from Ohio. And for one evening, her house felt less like a tomb and more like a home. "This is the first Christmas that has not felt completely awful since Thomas died," Margaret said as they sat by the stove after dinner, the small tree glowing in the lamplight. "I am glad," Samuel said quietly. "You deserve to have something that does not hurt." Margaret looked at him, really looked at him, seeing not just the hired help or the kind neighbor but the man. The man who had shown up with oats and barley when she needed it most. The man who had spent months earning her trust, one small gesture at a time. The man who made her feel less alone in a way she had not thought possible after Thomas. "Why do you not have someone?" she asked suddenly. "A man like you, hardworking, kind. Why are you not married?" Samuel was quiet for a long moment. "I was engaged once, girl back in Missouri. But after my mother died and I had to head west to find work, she did not want to wait. She married the banker's son instead." He smiled without humor. "Cannot say I blame her. I had nothing to offer but good intentions and strong hands. She was a fool." The words were out before Margaret could stop them, and she felt her face flush hot. But Samuel just looked at her with those gray-green eyes, and something in his expression made her breath catch. "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe she just knew I was not the right person for her. Maybe we both needed to end up somewhere else, someone else." The air between them felt charged, dangerous. Margaret stood up abruptly, gathering their empty plates with shaking hands. "I should clean up. You must be tired." Samuel stood too, but he did not move toward the door. "Margaret," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name. "I need you to know something. I came here to help you because it was the right thing to do. But I stayed because being near you makes me feel like maybe there is still good things possible in this world. Like maybe all the hard times led to something worthwhile." Margaret stood frozen at her wash basin, her hands submerged in cold water, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. "Samuel, you do not have to say anything," he continued. "I know it has not been that long since your husband passed. I know you might never feel about me the way I am starting to feel about you, but I needed to say it. I needed you to know that this is not just charity for me anymore, has not been for a while." He left then, walking out into the December night before Margaret could find words. She stood at the basin for a long time after, staring at her reflection in the darkened window. Her face looked different than it had 6 months ago. Thinner, yes, but also somehow more alive. Less like a woman waiting to die and more like a woman remembering how to live. She thought about Thomas, about their 5 years together. She had loved him, truly loved him, but it had been a practical love built on shared goals and mutual respect. What she felt growing inside her for Samuel was different. It was terrifying and exhilarating and felt like standing too close to a fire. Was it too soon? The women in town certainly thought so. But those women had not spent months alone in a dying homestead, watching the man they loved turn into memory. Those women had not felt the slow thaw of Samuel's kindness, the careful way he had rebuilt her trust in humanity one morning at a time. That night, Margaret made a decision. The next morning, when Samuel came in from feeding the horses, she had coffee ready and something else. A plate of apple fritters made with the last of her preserved apples, the kind Thomas had loved and she had not been able to make since his death. "These are amazing," Samuel said after his first bite, and the simple pleasure in his voice made Margaret smile. "My mother's recipe," she said. "I have not made them in a long time." They ate in comfortable silence, and when Samuel stood to leave for the Henderson ranch, Margaret walked him to the door. She put her hand on his arm, feeling the solid warmth of him through his jacket. "Last night," she said. "What you said, I have been thinking about it." Samuel went very still. "Margaret, if I made you uncomfortable, you did not. You made me feel something I had not felt in a long time. You made me feel like maybe I am allowed to want something other than just survival." She took a breath, gathering courage. "I am not ready for anything fast. I am not ready for promises or declarations. But I would like to know if maybe, someday, there could be something more than just neighborly help between us." The smile that broke across Samuel's face was like sunrise. "Someday sounds just fine to me. I am a patient man, Margaret Harper. I can wait for someday." Winter deepened, and with it, something else deepened between them. They were careful, proper, nothing that would give the town gossips real ammunition. But there were small touches now. Samuel's hand on Margaret's back as he helped her across an icy patch. Margaret's fingers brushing his as she handed him his morning coffee. Long conversations by the stove on cold evenings, talking about everything and nothing. Samuel told her about growing up in Missouri, about the father he barely remembered, and the mother he had tried so hard to save. About moving west after she died, working 100 different jobs, learning that home was not a place but a feeling you carried inside. Margaret told him about Ohio, about marrying Thomas at 19, and thinking she understood what love meant. About the miscarriages she had suffered, 2 lost babies that had left her wondering if this land took everything it touched. About the guilt she felt for being alive when Thomas was not. "It is not wrong to survive," Samuel said one evening in late January, after Margaret had confessed how angry she sometimes felt at Thomas for dying, for leaving her alone. "It is not wrong to want to be happy again." "How do you know?" Margaret asked. "How do you know I deserve happiness after the things I have thought, the ways I have resented him? Because you are human. Because grief is not neat and pretty. Because the fact that you are asking these questions means you have a conscience, and people with consciences generally deserve good things." Samuel reached across the table and took her hand, the first time he had held it. "Thomas would not want you to spend the rest of your life as a living memorial to him. He would want you to live." Margaret laced her fingers through his, feeling the calluses on his palm, the strength in his grip. "I think I am starting to understand that." February brought a thaw, and with it, news from town that changed everything. The Henderson ranch was selling out to a bigger operation from Colorado. The new owners were bringing their own workers. Samuel would be out of a job by March. He told Margaret over dinner, his voice carefully neutral, but she could see the worry in his eyes. "What will you do?" she asked. "Look for work. There are other ranches, other towns. I will find something." He did not look at her when he said it, and Margaret realized with sudden clarity that he was preparing to leave, to walk away from her homestead, from the life they had been carefully building together. The thought hit her like a physical blow. "Or you could stay here," she said. Samuel's head came up sharply. "Margaret, I mean it. This homestead is too much for one person, but it is manageable for two. You could work this land with me. We could make it something real, something sustainable, together." "What are you saying?" Margaret's heart was pounding, but her voice was steady. "I am saying that somewhere between the oats and barley and the fixed roof and the morning coffee, I fell in love with you, Samuel Peterson. I am saying I do not want you to go. I am saying that if you feel even half of what I feel, then maybe we should stop pretending this is just about neighborly help." Samuel stood up so fast his chair scraped against the floor. He crossed to her side of the table and pulled her to her feet, his hands gentle despite the urgency in his movement. "I feel all of it," he said, his voice rough. "Every bit of it and more. I love you, Margaret. Have loved you since about the third time I came by and you met me on the porch with coffee and that suspicious look on your face like you could not figure out what my angle was." Margaret laughed, a sound that came from somewhere deep and genuine. "I thought you were going to try to steal my land." "I am trying to steal something," Samuel said, his forehead resting against hers. "But it is not your land. It is your heart if you will let me." "It is yours," Margaret whispered. "It has been yours for a while now." When he kissed her, it tasted like new beginnings and second chances. It tasted like spring coming after a hard winter, like hope after despair. Margaret kissed him back and felt the last frozen parts of her grief start to thaw. They were married in April, a simple ceremony in Laramie with Mrs. Chen from the general store and her husband as witnesses. Margaret wore her Sunday dress and carried wildflowers Samuel had picked that morning. The preacher gave them a skeptical look, clearly aware of their living arrangements over the winter, but he married them nonetheless. The town gossips had plenty to say, but Margaret found she did not care. Let them talk. She had spent months alone and broken, and Samuel had put her back together piece by piece with nothing but kindness and persistence. If that was scandalous, then she would wear the scandal proudly. They worked the homestead together that first year, and it thrived in ways it never had when Margaret was alone or even when Thomas was alive. Samuel had a knack for reading the land, for knowing when to plant and when to wait, when to push and when to be patient. They expanded the stable and bought 2 more horses, began raising a small herd of cattle, planted a larger vegetable garden. Margaret discovered she did love this land after all. Not because Thomas had loved it, but because she and Samuel were building something together, something that was entirely theirs. The first winter they spent as husband and wife was mild compared to the year before. They stayed warm together in the house, the same house where Margaret had once thought she would die alone. Now it was filled with laughter and conversation and plans for the future. "I want to add a room," Samuel said one evening in February, studying the house's simple structure. "Maybe 2. This place is solid, but it is small. We will need more space." "More space for what?" Margaret asked, though she thought she knew. Samuel looked at her with those gray-green eyes, and she saw her own hope reflected there. "For a family, if you want that. I know you lost babies before, and if you do not want to try again, I understand. But if you do, I want to be ready." Margaret had thought her body was broken, that this land had taken her ability to carry life along with everything else it had taken. But looking at Samuel, at the life they had built together, she felt something shift inside her. "I want that," she said. "I want to try." The room was finished by June, a proper addition that made the house feel like a home. Margaret discovered she was pregnant in July, and this time, the pregnancy held. She was sick in the mornings and exhausted by evening, but Samuel took on extra work without complaint, doing everything he could to make her comfortable. "You are growing our child," he said when she apologized for being useless. "That is work enough." Their son was born in March of 1885, during a snowstorm that seemed determined to prove Wyoming still had teeth. The midwife from town barely made it through the drifts, but she got there in time to help Margaret through the hardest labor of her life. When Samuel saw his son for the first time, he cried. Proper tears that ran down his weathered face as he held the tiny bundle with infinite care. "He is perfect," Samuel said, his voice breaking. "Margaret, he is absolutely perfect." They named him Thomas, for the man who had come before, and James for Samuel's father. Thomas James Peterson, a child born into love and possibility. Margaret healed slowly from the birth, but Samuel was patient, taking care of both her and the baby with the same steady competence he brought to everything else. He walked the floors with Thomas when he cried at night. He changed diapers without complaint. He looked at his son like he was witnessing a miracle. "I never thought I would have this," Samuel said one night, the baby asleep on his chest as they sat by the stove. "A family. A home. I thought that ship had sailed when I left Missouri." "The ship just took the long way around," Margaret said, leaning against his shoulder. "But it got here eventually." The years that followed were not without their challenges. The weather was unpredictable, and there were droughts and hard winters and times when money was tight. But they faced everything together, Margaret and Samuel, building their homestead into something that could sustain them, and then some. Thomas grew into a sturdy boy with his father's gray-green eyes and his mother's stubborn determination. He loved the horses and the wide Wyoming sky, and he laughed easily, a sound that filled the house with joy. When Thomas was 3, Margaret got pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy came with less fear and more confidence. Their daughter was born in November, a squalling red-faced baby they named Sarah after Samuel's mother. "Your mother would have loved her," Margaret said, watching Samuel cradle his daughter with the same wonder he had shown their son. "She would have loved all of this," Samuel agreed. "Would have loved knowing that someone got it right, that someone managed to build the life she could not." By 1890, the homestead was thriving. Samuel had proven himself an excellent rancher, and their small operation had grown into something respectable. They employed 2 ranch hands seasonally, and had built a proper barn to replace the old stable. The house had been expanded twice more, with a real kitchen and a parlor and separate bedrooms for the children. Margaret looked at what they had built and could hardly believe it was the same place where she had once stood at the window, blood on her hands and despair in her heart. That woman felt like a stranger now, someone from a different life. "You ever think about how we met?" she asked Samuel one evening as they sat on their expanded porch, watching the sunset paint the prairie gold and red. "Every day," Samuel said. "Best decision I ever made, bringing you that feed." "Best decision I ever made was letting you," Margaret replied. "Even though I thought you probably had some ulterior motive." "I did have an ulterior motive," Samuel admitted with a grin. "I wanted to impress the pretty widow. Worked out better than I could have hoped." Margaret swatted his arm playfully, but she was smiling. "You harvested more than just my trust, Samuel Peterson. You harvested my whole heart. And you gave me something I did not think I deserved, a second chance, a real home, a reason to wake up happy every morning." He took her hand, his thumb running over her wedding ring, the simple gold band he had bought in Laramie all those years ago. "I love you, Margaret, More now than the day we married, and I loved you plenty then." "I love you too," Margaret said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. Thomas came running around the corner of the house then, his sister toddling behind him, shrieking with laughter. They were playing some game only children understood, and their joy was infectious. Samuel scooped up Sarah as she passed, lifting her high in the air and making her squeal with delight. Margaret caught Thomas and pulled him into a hug, breathing in the scent of dirt and grass and childhood. This was what she had survived for. This moment, this family, this impossible beautiful life that had grown from the ashes of her grief. The homestead that had nearly killed her had instead become the foundation for something extraordinary. That night, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Margaret stood at the window where she had once watched the sun rise on her despair. Samuel came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "About how lost I was," Margaret said honestly. "About how certain I was that I would never be happy again. About how wrong I was." "You were not wrong to feel that way. You were grieving. You had lost everything that mattered to you." "But then you showed up with Oats and Barley," Margaret said, turning in his arms to face him. "And you kept showing up day after day, asking for nothing, just being there, just being you. You did not just feed my horses, Samuel. You fed something in me that was starving. You gave me a reason to keep going when I had none." "You gave yourself a reason," Samuel corrected gently. "You got up every morning and took care of those animals even when you wanted to give up. You were already fighting to survive when I met you. I just helped make the fight a little easier." "We helped each other," Margaret said, "and we keep helping each other. That is what makes this work. That is what makes us work." Samuel kissed her then, soft and sweet, the kiss of two people who had chosen each other over and over again, through hard times and good. The years continued to pass with the steady rhythm of seasons. Thomas grew tall and strong, taking after his father in build and temperament. Sarah grew into a bright, curious girl who loved books and horses in equal measure. The homestead expanded further, becoming one of the more successful small ranches in the area. In 1895, Margaret gave birth to another daughter, Emma, and 2 years later, a son they named William. The house rang with children's voices and laughter, and Margaret thought sometimes about the quiet tomb it had been when she was alone, and she was grateful beyond measure for the noise. Samuel proved to be an exceptional father, patient and kind but firm when necessary. He taught the boys to work the land and ride the horses, and he taught the girls the same things, insisting that everyone needed to know how to be self-sufficient. "You never know when life is going to knock you down," he told Sarah when she complained about learning to mend fence posts. "Better to know how to stand back up on your own." Margaret watched her husband with their children and fell in love with him all over again, seeing the man he had become, the father he had always deserved to be. The turn of the century came and went, bringing with it changes to Laramie and the Wyoming territory. Statehood had come in 1890, bringing new opportunities and new challenges. The wild days of the frontier were giving way to something more settled, more civilized, though the land itself remained as unforgiving as ever. Samuel and Margaret adapted with the times, modernizing where it made sense, but keeping the core of what made their ranch work. They were respected in the community now, known for their fairness and hard work. The gossip that had once surrounded their relationship had faded into distant memory, replaced by admiration for what they had built together. On their 15th wedding anniversary, Samuel took Margaret into Laramie for dinner at the hotel restaurant, a rare luxury they both enjoyed. The children stayed with Mrs. Chen, who had become a dear friend over the years, one of the few people who had never judged Margaret for finding love again. Over roast beef and potatoes, Samuel pulled out a small velvet box. "You already gave me a ring," Margaret said, confused but pleased. "This is something different," Samuel said. "Open it." Inside was a locket, silver and delicately engraved with wildflowers. Margaret opened it carefully and found two small photographs inside. One of Thomas Harper, taken shortly before his death, a photo Margaret had thought lost. The other was of Samuel, taken last year during a rare trip to a proper photographer. "I do not want you to forget him," Samuel said quietly. "He was part of your life, part of what made you who you are. He deserves to be remembered." Margaret felt tears spill over, running hot down her cheeks. "Samuel, I do not even know what to say. Say you will wear it. Say you will remember that you can love more than one person, that having loved him does not make loving me any less real." Margaret reached across the table and took his hand. This man who had understood her from the very beginning, who had never been jealous of her grief or her past. "I will wear it every day," she promised. "And I will remember that I am the luckiest woman alive to have been loved by two good men." They walked through Laramie that night hand in hand, talking about their children, their plans for the ranch, the life they had built together. The streets were quiet, lit by electric lamps now instead of lanterns, progress marching steadily forward. "You ever miss the early days?" Margaret asked. "When it was just us and the homestead and everything was harder?" Samuel considered the question seriously. "I miss the simplicity sometimes, but I would not trade what we have now for anything. Our children, our success, the knowledge that we built something lasting. That is worth all the complications that came with growth." "I feel the same way," Margaret admitted, "though I do not miss the fear. The constant worry about whether we would make it through another winter." "We will always make it through," Samuel said with confidence. "As long as we are together, we will figure it out," and they did. Through droughts and floods, through illness and injury, through the normal trials of raising 4 children on a working ranch, they figured it out. They leaned on each other, trusted each other, loved each other through everything. Thomas grew up and married a girl from town, bringing her to the ranch and starting his own family. Samuel taught him how to manage the operation, slowly passing on the knowledge and responsibility. Sarah shocked everyone by going to college in Cheyenne, becoming a teacher, and then shocking them even more by coming back to Laramie to teach at the local school. Emma and William were still young, but they showed every sign of being as capable and determined as their older siblings. In 1910, Samuel and Margaret celebrated their 25th anniversary. The whole family gathered at the ranch for a party that lasted 2 days. Friends came from all over the county, people whose lives had been touched by the Petersons' generosity and kindness over the years. As the sun set on the second day, with music playing and children running wild across the yard, Margaret found Samuel standing apart from the crowd, looking out over the land they had built together. She joined him in the quiet, slipping her hand into his. "Thinking deep thoughts?" she asked. "Thinking about the day I first came here," Samuel said. "You were so fierce, standing in that doorway with your rifle, so determined not to need anyone." "I was terrified," Margaret admitted, "of you, of what you represented, of everything. And now I cannot imagine any of this without you. You are woven into every part of my life, Samuel. Every good thing I have, we built together." Samuel turned to her, and even after all these years, looking into his gray-green eyes still made her heart skip. "I came here with 2 bags of oats and barley. I left with everything that matters." "You gave me back my life," Margaret said. "You taught me that surviving and living are not the same thing, that it is possible to heal without forgetting. That trust can be rebuilt, even when it has been shattered." "We taught each other," Samuel corrected. You taught me that patience pays off, that slow and steady wins the race. That showing up every morning, being reliable, being honest, that is what love looks like in practice." They stood together in the gathering dusk, watching their family celebrate, watching the life they had created continue to grow and expand beyond them. The homestead that had almost been Margaret's tomb had become a legacy, something that would continue long after they were gone. The years continued their steady march. Samuel's hair turned white, and Margaret's face gained lines that told the story of a life well lived. Their children had children, and the ranch remained in the family, passing from generation to generation. They grew old together, these two people who had found each other in the midst of loss and desperation. They worked side by side until arthritis and age forced them to slow down, and then they sat side by side on the porch they had built together, watching the Wyoming sky paint itself new colors every evening. "You have any regrets?" Margaret asked one day when they were both well into their 70s. Samuel thought about it seriously, as he thought about everything. "I regret that my mother did not get to see this, that she did not get to know that her struggling, her sacrifice, it mattered. It led to us, to all of this. I wish she had known that her story did not end in tragedy, that there was more to come." "She knows," Margaret said with certainty. "Wherever she is, she knows, and she is proud of you. What about you? Regrets?" Margaret looked out over the land, the home, the life. "I regret that Thomas did not get to see what this place became, but I do not regret anything that came after he died. I do not regret choosing to live again. I do not regret choosing you." "Best choice you ever made," Samuel said with a grin. "Second best," Margaret corrected. "Best choice was deciding to get out of bed the morning after Thomas died instead of staying there forever. Everything else followed from that." Samuel took her hand, his grip less strong than it once was but no less steady. "Then I am grateful you got out of bed. I am grateful you asked for oats and barley. I am grateful you let me help. I am grateful you kept coming back," Margaret said. "I am grateful you saw something in me worth saving when I did not see it myself." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set, as it had set thousands of times before and would set thousands of times after. Two people who had found each other when they needed it most, who had built something beautiful from grief and kindness, who had proven that second chances were real and love could bloom even in the hardest soil. Samuel Peterson died peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1920 at the age of 65. Margaret held his hand as he went, whispering that she loved him, that he had been her salvation, that she would carry him in her heart until they met again. She lived another 5 years after that, surrounded by children and grandchildren, helping to run the ranch until the very end. On a spring morning in 1925, Margaret Harper Peterson passed away in the same house where she had once stood certain she would die alone. Her granddaughter found her in her rocking chair, looking out the window at the stable that Samuel had repaired all those years ago, a peaceful smile on her face. In her hand was the silver locket, worn smooth from decades of wear, holding the images of the two men who had loved her truly. They buried her next to Samuel on a hill overlooking the ranch, and Thomas Harper was there too, not forgotten but honored as part of the story that had led to everything after. 3 graves, 3 people whose lives had intertwined in ways both tragic and beautiful, whose combined legacy lived on in the land and the family that remained. The homestead continued, passed down through Thomas James Peterson and his children, and their children after them. The story of how it all began, of the widow who asked for oats and barley and the cowboy who harvested her trust each morning, became family legend, told and retold with love and reverence, because it was a story worth telling. A story of survival and hope, of patience and persistence, of two broken people who found each other and built something whole. A story that proved love did not always come easy or fast, but when it came slow and steady, when it was built on trust and respect and showing up day after day, it lasted. It lasted through hard times and good times, through winters that tried to break them and springs that brought renewal. It lasted through children and grandchildren, through the transformation of the Wild West into something more settled but no less demanding. It lasted because Samuel and Margaret had understood from the beginning that real love was not just feeling but action, not just promise but practice. The oats and barley that had brought them together were long gone, consumed by horses that were themselves dust decades ago. But what they represented, the simple act of seeing someone in need and choosing to help without expectation, that remained. It remained in the family that bore their names, in the land they had worked together, in the story that was told on summer evenings when the family gathered. The widow had asked for oats and barley, desperate and alone, expecting nothing but the continued struggle of survival. The cowboy had harvested her trust each morning, patiently and persistently proving himself worthy of it. And from that simple beginning, from those bags of grain and early morning visits, from coffee on the porch and roofs repaired and wood chopped, and 1,000 small kindnesses, they had built a love story for the ages. Not because it was dramatic or explosive or love at first sight, but because it was real. Because it honored what came before while embracing what could be. Because it proved that endings could also be beginnings, that grief could coexist with joy, that broken hearts could heal and love again. And in the end, that was the truest kind of love story. Not the kind that burned bright and fast, but the kind that smoldered slow and steady, building heat and light that lasted a lifetime and beyond. The kind that changed lives and created legacies and proved that sometimes all you needed was someone willing to show up with oats and barley, asking for nothing, offering everything. That was what Samuel Peterson had given Margaret Harper. Not just grain for her horses, but hope for her heart. Not just repairs for her homestead, but rebuilding for her soul. And she had given him the same in return, a place to belong, a reason to stay, a love that made all his wandering worthwhile. Their story ended as all stories must, with death and dust and the slow fade of memory. But it also never ended, living on in the people they had created, the land they had nurtured. The love they had proven was possible even in the hardest times. The wind still blew across the Wyoming prairie, cold and relentless as it had always been. But on the Peterson ranch, the building stood strong against it, built by two people who had understood that surviving the storm required shelter you built together. One board at a time, one nail at a time, one morning at a time. The widow had needed oats and barley, and the cowboy had harvested her trust. From such simple ingredients, they had created something extraordinary. A life, a family, a love that lasted beyond death, and that was more than enough. That was everything.